to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast. Today, we are chatting about how do you know when things are going great in your business and how do you know when they are not, right? And I have a guest with me today. His name is David Princeton. So David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tracy. Honored to be here.
It's great to have you here. So David's the principal consultant at Advocate Claim Services. So David and I have worked together on a couple of clients in the past and kind of meandered our way back and forth. He is the person that I call when I have insurance questions that are related more to like property and casualty or work comp questions when I'm like, I know enough to be really dangerous and know that I'm going to fall flat on my face. I call David.
Well, thank you for that, Tracy. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Would you agree that that's a true story?
Those are true statements. And I think one of the great reasons why you can trust to call me is because I don't actually sell the products. So I'm not trying to necessarily mark things up or change a program because I don't have an interest in that, right?
Right.
So
right.
Yeah, just good, honest risk management advice.
And it's good for sure. So, as we dig in, like, hey, how do you diagnose what's not going great in the business? And so often on our podcast, our listeners hear us diagnosing people problems, right? And that fact that every business problem is really a people problem. And you and I, David, talked a lot about this with work comp claims. And, how do we mitigate those work comp claims? And because they definitely become a business problem, but so much of it is how are we handling and working with and empowering our people?
Right. And so a lot of that intersection comes back to that idea of expectations becoming agreements and the disconnect that happens between those things. So a lot of times I would imagine, at least in HR, you have a lot of expectations, right, of people's performance or the way that they do it. But did anyone actually seek out an agreement around those expectations? Did we verbalize it? Did we actualize it? Did we build operations and process? Did we do all of those things around the expectations of the business, of the leader, of the employee, right? And did we get them to the point of becoming agreements? They're formalized, they're understood, and we have executable and actionable items to take. A lot of what I see in my world is a complete disconnect between the expectations of a policyholder, in this case, a business, and what their insurance program actually is going to do for them in the time of a loss. And the neat part is the process for that is a really, really ancient principle. It's called reading. And so,
wait. We have to read? Don't we just have like Davids for that?
Well, so number one, yes, you have Davids for that because David loves to read insurance contracts and right. And that are thick, right? So literally on my desk, I have a company's insurance portfolio that is 7 binders thick. So 7 1-inch binders thick of beautiful promise, right? So schedules of property, all the different liability coverages, all the warranty statements, all the applications that were made, all those things, right? No doubt a lot of work went into it. I've been untangling it so that the expectations that business owner actually has ended up in that paperwork.
Right.
And what I'm finding is a large disconnect. So I'm finding gaps within their insurance programs. Not all locations that they own actually made it into the policy, right? So that's kind of a big deal when you're a real estate company. So, and then just all the other little nuances, right? So, how is vacancy defined, right? Is it vacancy somehow connected to occupancy? Right. Do I just have to have it furnished? All those fun little things.
Yeah. And so when we make this relevant for our HR listeners, and so I'm going to focus on work comp right now for a second and look at some of those work comp, because you and I played with a number of these, right? Like one specifically was hey, we have a situation where we have somebody out on work comp. We don't want him sitting at home. So we're going to put him in. I love the fact that you're cracking up right now. So we're going to put him or her into, a community situation where they can go ahead and do some work. That's fantastic. Like those programs can work really, really well, as long as the way they're written benefits the organization. And in our situation, what we found is and this wasn't just the situation, I've had it in others in the past, is if we don't follow up with the employee and the organization on what they're actually doing, they can get too comfortable and not want to actually come back to work.
Right. And or their expectations changed, right? Around what they're getting paid to do. So it's interesting, Tracy. So you're talking about return to work programs, and these are wonderful, wonderful tools for business owners to have. There can be some tax benefits. Talk to a qualified CPA about that. But the insurance benefits it's a way to ultimately reduce the impact of the claim on your mod, right? So that mod impact ultimately gets diminished. But here's the teeter-totter, right? So if you're going to put somebody in a nonprofit area to work, right, so that they can perform tasks within their limitations, you as the company are paying that payroll. Yep. And that's the savings, right, that ultimately stays off of your work comp loss history. Well, there's a right way to use that tool and there's a wrong way to use that tool, right? The right way is for sort of like a short-term gap fill. Right? This person might return to full duty in, 2 weeks or something like that. Or, we have some questions about this employee's willingness to return to work. So let's put them into a work environment where, performing the work for a nonprofit. So like sorting donations at a Goodwill, for example, sorting those clothes might be a worse task than the work that they perform for us as the employer. Right. And so how do we get them back into that employment role? All being cognizant and aware of their limitations. Right. So can we meet these accommodations?
So with that, I have some employers that will call me and say, hey, Tracy, can I just have them count staples in the office because it's worse than doing the work? The answer is yes, you can.
Yeah, no. And there's not a problem with the tasks being assigned. The difference is that it just has to be within their accommodations, right? Within their limitations, but going back to even contemplating the idea of that alternative work, if you don't have clearly defined job descriptions, if you don't have clearly defined physical performance activities, and if that doesn't make it into that doctor's appointment, wherever that employee chooses to treat, if it doesn't make it into that appointment, it becomes really hard for the physician to then define what those accommodations can be, right? Because they don't have an idea of those limitations or how to work within it.
Correct. And this goes back to your first point of our expectations showing up in the agreements, and we can take that to work comp. And I know you can take it to a million other areas that you serve organizations with, but it's so important that it's crystal clear what that is. One of the things that we do is we actually send them a letter that says, here is the amount of time we are going to give you this accommodation. Here's the requirements for that. And here's what that looks like, right? So that's in writing for them. And that kind of goes into how do we respond to those things when that comes up? And knowing that throughout that process, and I'm going to throw this back to you, when do you make a claim? When do you call work comp? When do you get your insurance agent involved? Like, where does all those things happen?
Right. So immediately is the best answer that I can give.
Yes.
From a compliance perspective, 24 hours, and keep in mind weekends count in that time. Like there's no such thing as taking a day off, right?
And there's this little thing called OSHA out there that cares about workplace injuries.
Yes, and OSHA, and then there's mandatory reporting that, for different severities of incidents that have to go back to OSHA. And, so one of the things that I'm a big proponent of is something called a nurse triage line. Right. So if so a nurse triage line can be a completely freelanced attach on to your HR program. Right. So you can go out, you could find your own vendor. But ideally, what you would do is that nurse triage line would ultimately be able to bolt on to your workers' comp carrier. Right. And the reason why is that what a nurse can do is when you have an incident that happens in the field or in your facility, they can find a private room, and with the magic of technology, they can do video chat, right? They can give course of treatment. They can keep people from going to the ER for a paper cut, right? Which all helps impact the mod. Why get a $5,000 bill when they can go to urgent care for $200, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, kind of keep things medical only, or just provide that initial medical guidance that an employer commonly is not licensed to provide. 2022, we don't live in the rub some dirt on it and get back to work environment of a workplace anymore.
Are you sure?
So I would say if you're rubbing dirt on something, you're asking for some bigger problems.
Right.
Right. And then I would say that there's a difference, right, between what an employee chooses to do and then once it becomes known to management. Right. So if an employee chooses to not disclose, not do those things, that's kind of their choice. But the moment that the company or its representative becomes aware of it, that's where we have to have proper process. That's where we have to have proper reporting. And that's where we're having a strong background in notifying workers' comp carriers, right? Getting adjusters involved, asking for nurse case managers to show up at those appointments, right? Because they can be in the room, right? And then, really just trying to all for the benefit of the employee, right? And that's the one thing to maybe point out is we're doing this all for the benefit of the employee,
Mm-hmm.
right? So workers' comp is one of three forms of what I like to call entitlement insurance, meaning that if you're an employee and you're injured, you're entitled to the benefits.
Right.
Nothing's going to stop you from getting them, right? Now, as the business, you have decisions that you can make, right, that can reduce the impact that the benefits being provided that employee during their course of healing have on your ability to be competitive in the marketplace, right? So one of those is a pre-loss risk review, right? So are you having loss control, whether it's from your insurance company or from your broker or, again, an independent vendor? Are they going around and looking at your facilities to make sure that you're meeting OSHA compliance standards, that safeguards are on the machines, right? That things are not being modified. If you're a construction company and you're out in the field and your environment is constantly changing and subject to the elements, right? What are those processes? What are those loss control measures that we're taking? How are extension cords, for example? Extension cords and ice are the biggest scourge that exists, right?
Because
they're trip hazards.
Falls, right?
Right, trips and falls. It's number one loss leader anywhere. Slip, trip, and fall. Right, super broad category. But it's all that proactive part that goes into managing an effective business, and it becomes an expense. But where that expense hits your ability to go to market and to price your services or your products or your goods, running an effective safety is what lets you be more competitive, right? So if you have, a mod is a 1.0, right?
Yep.
Meaning that you are exactly where you need to be from the risk class that you're grouped in, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're a 0.48 mod, you're paying less. You're at least half, right, of what your next competitor who's a 1 is going to pay for workers' comp coverage, right? But again, if you're a 1.5, you're paying a penalty, right? So your cost of goods, your cost of services is going to be higher.
Right.
So,
and not only that, you're probably losing contracts because of it.
Correct. Yes. Especially in a construction field where you have to have certain expectations, certain performances have to be met, assurances have to be given. Not to say that you can't get a good guy letter and you can't get these other things and you can't show a concerted effort is being made with a focus on safety and reducing losses. Because the interesting thing about your mod is it's a 4-year trail where the last 3 years count, right? So that's, and it's based off of the principle that maturity of claims, that claims, the longer they go on, the higher they go, right? And so the WCRB, right, they want to look at, or the Wisconsin Rating Bureau, they want to look at that 3-year trailing, or that 4-year trailing, 3 years counting kind of average, right? So they want to give employees a chance to get their full benefits.
Right. Absolutely. So as we look at this kind of insurance as a whole, one of those key things that we talked about is diagnosing where something is potentially wrong before you end up with a loss, right? And like I said at the very beginning, we do this so often. If we do an employee survey, we're diagnosing what's wrong so we can fix it before we have a significant amount of turnover. And, when we look at insurance and, from talking with so many HR professionals, one of the things that comes up so often is I don't really understand what I'm looking at and how to make a recommendation to, to our executive team, to our CEO, to our owner with us. And, David, I know you've got some kind of really key tips and tricks for our listeners as far as, hey, make sure you look at these things when you're looking at whether it's benefits, insurance, or whether it's property and casualty. So I'm just going to pick your brain right now and say, like, what are those top things that are really important for our listeners to kind of pay attention to as they're going into, because typically we go into renewals in the fall. And so we're getting there close to that. So what are some of those key things to look at, whether at a renewal or when we're looking at a new broker?
Sure. So I'll separate this into two categories of advice, right?
Sure.
So property and casualty, right? So, your liability coverages, your workers' comp, your property insurance, your auto, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then employee benefits on the other side, right? So on the property and casualty side, a nice little acronym, RTFP, right? So read the full policy. So that's number one, right? One of the things to understand about the great state of Wisconsin, and for any state, right? So insurance is state regulated, but in the great state of Wisconsin, a broker has no responsibility to you as the policyholder to actually read the promise that they're delivering to you, right? The obligation in Wisconsin is actually pretty low. If you ask them for $1 million limit of liability, they have to go out and get you $1 million liability, or try to. I should emphasize try to. They don't have to succeed, right? They just have to try. They have to request, right? So beyond that, the idea that somebody is actually reading the promise that ends up on your desk, that ends up being delivered, that you paid good money for, is very narrow, right? There's a lot of learning by allegory, right? So storytelling, this one time this was covered and this other time this was covered, right? But quite honestly, like reading the full policy is great. So reading the full policy, if you've never read an insurance policy before, it's actually really good to read it because it's going to cause you to ask questions. Mm-hmm. And when you go back and you ask your broker these questions that you've generated, right, you're going to find out what kind of metal your broker is made of, right? So if they're able to engage with you and show you with the policy and sit down and actually engage in a meaningful way and walk you through all of the questions that you've developed from reading the policy, right, that's a really good broker. If they try to come back and say, hey, let's do something else, or, don't worry about it, you're covered, right? And they try to minimize, kind of your questions or your inquiry, that can be a sign of a bad broker, right?
Right. And here's what I will say is there's no stupid question there. Even like, hey, I don't understand what this language means, or what's in line 15.2 IF. I don't understand how it aligns back to, three lines or three paragraphs above it, because that becomes incredibly important, especially when situations come up.
Right.
And they will.
Right. And so, and we are talking about workers' comp, right?
Right.
So one of the most beautiful questions I think anybody can ask an insurance broker is, what is employer's liability? So AKA workers' comp 1B coverage, right? So 1A is the workers' comp promise, 1B employer's liability. What is employer's liability and how does it work? Mm-hmm. Right. So if they can answer that question in a meaningful way in the state of Wisconsin, that's a sign of a good broker, right? I don't know if I should give away the answer or not. So you tell me.
Well, why don't you give away a answer? Because there could be several that they can use as a litmus test, right?
Right. But going back to reading the full policy. So in the state, so I mentioned that in the state of Wisconsin, one of the duty is to ask for limits.
Yeah.
Well, in other states, right? So for example, like the great state of Texas, right? So in other states, the duty there is actually on the policyholder to read and understand their policy. Mm-hmm. Right. So the broker actually is absolved. They have no responsibility to even read or understand the policy they're selling you, right? In other states, the standard is actually shifted and it is placed on the broker, right, to read and understand and know the policy or the promise that's being sold. So the point is especially if you're based in a state and have operations in many or multiple states, understanding where your promise is being delivered, right, and where your broker's feet are, right, as far as what state they're in, you could end up in a situation where your broker's in, and I'll just use states again as an example, your broker's in Minnesota and your operations are in Iowa, and you have, or your headquarters in Iowa, and you have operations in Wisconsin, New York, Florida, and, Oklahoma, right? So where is that insurance transaction actually taking place?
Right.
Right. If it's a Minnesota-based brokerage, are they large enough to understand when you're talking to that underwriter or that carrier about how anti-indemnity statutes in Minnesota impact the formation of a promise that's then going to be delivered in Iowa, where you don't have anti-indemnity statutes, right? So like all those little things, all those little nuances is that level of detail. So RTFP.
So I will just name this. You just went over my head, and I'm naming this for our listeners. So if you're listening in and going, what the heck did David just say? This is such the importance of having a broker where you can dig in and at least ask the questions to say, pull out some of these things that David just said, just to see, hey, do they know enough to know where we're at, especially if you have multi-states and the broker's in a different state, because this comes up all the time. And the other thing I want to point out right now is with remote work, what we're seeing so often is you are in, let's say, Wisconsin, and so you're in Wisconsin and Illinois, but you have remote workers in Colorado, in Texas, in New York, in California. Now, I picked 3 of the trickiest states in what I just listed off there, being Colorado, New York, and California. So with that being said, understanding that even if they are remote work from home, their butt is in the seat in that state, which means you have to follow the laws in that state. So we won't go any further than that, other than to say, like, you need to call somebody on that to help you through it.
So RTFP novice level, right, is read the policy, write down your list of questions, talk to your broker. If you're satisfied in that conversation, that dialogue, and you feel really good because your broker's giving you solid advice back because they actually are entertaining your questions, wonderful, right? RTFP, the Pro Edition, right? So read the full policy, the Pro Edition. If I'm talking over Tracy's head, one, I apologize for that.
Right.
But two,
I wanted to point that out because I have my listeners in my head going, wait a second, what did you just say? I'm going, I don't know either.
Right. Yeah. What part of this is English, right? So the RTFP Pro Edition, that's where you can reach out to companies like mine. So Advocate Claim Service, right?
Shameless plug. I love it. No.
Shameless plug, right? So Advocate Claim Service. So we read the full policy, right? We analyze it. We look for gaps. If it's over my head, I've got a series of consultants that I've developed relationships with over the past 20 years, all across the country, all in their own special niches, right? So there's all kinds of ways that you can get an answer or form a reasonable expectation of what this promise is, or find these gaps, right? If I can share with you one of the sexier gaps that exists in insurance policies, right? So cyber, right? So cyber insurance is a big conversation these days.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned remote work. We're doing this remotely, right? So it's the new form of business, finally, right? So cyber policies. Well, so there was a financial institution, right? So, very large bank. It was a credit union all across the country, right? And they, like every other bank, have an app that you engage with to make mobile deposits, to transfer funds, check your balances, all that great stuff. They had a cyber policy, had a $100 million limit of insurance, right? And it had a subcontractor exclusion. So what do you think happens when your federal insured limit, right, for that credit union is $250,000? You have more than that in the account, and a breach occurs through their vendor and subcontractor provided app, and your money's gone.
Right.
Right. So here, this financial institution thought they were buying cyber insurance coverage to protect that to the tune of $100 million worth of coverage, right? This ain't a cheap policy to buy. They got a subcontractor exclusion. Did the expectation meet the agreement, right?
No.
And here's the beautiful fix of these things. They can just be honest mistakes. They can be small oversights. Nobody's necessarily trying to pull a fast one over on you, as long as it's before the loss, because the underwriter can then just reform that policy relatively easily. In this particular case, there was no premium increase, right? So what did we do? We just we scheduled out the subcontractors, right? So when you think of your cyber policy that you bought, when you went out and got cloud computing, right? Mm-hmm. And you're clicking, I agree. You're clicking, I agree on every box without reading it. More than likely, you've agreed to accept all liability, right? That exists in that ecosystem if you're the source of access. Target hack is a great example, right? They came in through an HVAC contractor and somehow got into Target's point of sale devices, right? So all of those little things, right, are your expectations making it into that agreement. So RTFP Pro Edition, you can find people like me. You can find people in your geographic area. There's plenty of us that exist. If you're more comfortable doing business with somebody in your geographic area, more than happy to connect you if I happen to know somebody. So, and I know a lot of good people out there. So
absolutely. And that's what's so fantastic about our network, right? Like, I just need to be smart enough to ask the right questions and to know who to go to with that. And I think that when we create these communities, that's something that's incredibly important. So we have covered a ton of ground today, David. So what's that one kind of key actionable takeaway for our executives that listening into our conversation today?
So this is where I become maybe more of a realist, right? Mm-hmm. I would say find someone you trust to read the policy.
Right.
These are not easy contracts. These can be thousands of pages long. They can be hundreds of pages long. They're full of nuances. They change with statutes. They change with case law. They change contextually with what factually happens in a claim, right? Because they're all interpreted. So I think the advice I would have is probably this. If your insurance broker and your attorney, whoever you're using for legal, don't know each other on a first name basis, make that connection happen. Mm-hmm. Because your lawyer more than likely knows a lot about what you're getting yourself into. At least I hope so, as a business owner, right? I would hope your lawyer knows what you're getting yourself into. And your broker is assuming what you're getting yourself into when you call and say, hey, I need this limit so I can go into this contract and, actually get this client to sign, right? So get those two people. That'd probably be my biggest action item for you. So executive level, have one of them buy you lunch, right? And make the connection happen over a lunch and make sure that they're exchanging some information.
Awesome. And then for our HR listeners, I think we've talked about reading the full policy so that one, you're getting educated every time you do that. And, whether it is with brokers or with, going out for different policies, staying within the same broker, it's going to have you learn more because it definitely changes from year to year as that case law changes.
Correct.
Awesome.
Correct.
Anything else you want to add or share with our audience before we, say thank you for today? And I will give you a shameless plug here, David. And that is, if you are not a part of our Talent Optimization Foundation membership program, we do open office hours once a week. It's every Monday at 1:00. We also do webinars once a month, and David will be on an upcoming webinar, which we will have linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today, and check out our show notes, which will have the links to all things that related to David and to when that upcoming webinar is. So that being said, thank you for joining us for this episode of Talent Optimization, and we will see you next week.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.